All right, Matt, what are the statistics on this album?
Yes, so this album comes in at number 40 on Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, number 1 in 1974, and number 164 of all time. It's King Crimson's second highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind In the Court of the Crimson King, which we covered back in season 1. It did not make Rolling Stone's list, and I don't think the first one did either. I don't think any King Crimson's making it on Rolling Stone these days.
Okay. Yeah, so we last talked about, as Matt said, in season 1, episode 31 of Combing the Stacks. So kind of feels a long time ago now.
It does.
The last time we talked about him. But really, that album came out in 1969. So it's been, 5 years or so, 6 years from when this album came out. And they put out, in between then, they put out 6 albums between then and this release, October 6th, 1974. So I had forgotten a lot of what I had said the first episode and what happened in between then. But the big kind of broad strokes for this band is that they had a lot of lineup changes, right? To the point where the different iterations of their band are numbered. There's a whole Wikipedia article breaking down all the different iterations of the band, and often band members would leave or get kicked out or quit, sometimes within the same year. And they would sometimes
classic prog rock.
Yeah, sometimes they would bleed members and get to an amount that then put out the album, kind of like what happened here. They had started out with 5 members before that, and then 2 left and left with 3, and Robert Fripp was kind of in a weird place when this album came out with, but I'll get to that. And also he's the only remaining founding member left by the time Red comes out. So
I was just going to say, who's the stability here?
Well, he doesn't strike me as stable, but he definitely seems like the artistic driving force in some respect. So I'll kind of give a recap of what happens between Court of the Crimson King and up to now. In May of 1970, the band released In the Wake of Poseidon. Their second album reached 4 in the UK and 31 in the US. Their third album, Lizard, was released December of 1970 and had more avant-garde jazz and classical chamber music influences in it, and experimentation with the EMS VCS3 synthesizer. We haven't talked about that synth before. I did not do a deep dive onto what the significance of that synth was. It's not like the Tonto synth or anything like that, I think. But you can see that the synth is, how we've talked about with other bands, the synth is becoming more and more of a thing in the 70s. That album reached 29 in the UK and 113 in the US. So they're kind of on the down slope in terms of sales, at least. In December of 1971, they had a new iteration of the band, and their next album was called Islands, and it took lyrical inspiration from Homer's Odyssey and from jazz players like Miles Davis. So typical prog rock, pretentiousness, or however you want to, experimentation. It reached 30 in the UK and 76 in the US. So this is never, up to this point, this is a band that's never number 1 or insanely popular. Like most prog rock bands, they have a dedicated following, and they are for a hardcore niche group of people, really. Their next album after that was Earthbound, which was a live album released in June of 1972, and that was collected from their tour dates in the US in January and February of 72. Then we have a third lineup that was formed in July of 1972, and in March of 1973, their fifth album, Lark's Tongues and Aspic, was released and features more musical interplay between the band members, and influences like classical, more improvisation, and even heavy metal start making their way into the band. In that third lineup, one of the members was Jamie Muir. He left the band and joined a Scottish monastery, so he really got out of the music biz altogether. I thought that was interesting.
Yep.
In January of 1974, the remaining members of this third iteration recorded and released Starless and Black Bible in March of 1974. Most of this album was recorded live during their 73 tour, but they edited it and overdubbed it to sound like a studio recording, which is kind of different than what we've talked about with any band. I can't think of anyone that's tried to make a live album not sound like a live album. Their David Cross, their violinist and keyboardist, became frustrated with the band and was voted out after their tour in 74. Which then brings us to this album, Red, recorded between June and August of 74. The lineup consists of 3 members at this time: John Wetton on bass and lead vocals, Robert Fripp on guitar, keyboards, and electronics, and Bill Bruford of drums and percussion. During this time of the recording of the album, Robert Fripp became disillusioned with the music industry and turned to the works of Russian mystic George Gurdjieff. It's always a good idea to explore Russian mystics' ideas from a mental stability standpoint.
Not like Rasputin or something.
Yeah. I think I should have looked to see what George Gurdjieff's deal was. I'm sure I'm not even saying his last name right, but I think...
Hopefully it went better than how it went for the Romanovs with Rasputin.
Yeah. So as a result of this, during recording, he retreated inward, and really didn't contribute much to the album recording or opinions on how the album was recording, leaving the other 2, John and Bill, to make the decisions. I'm sure they were really pleased by that. Sounds like real camaraderie there. The album consists of the live track Providence, recorded in June of 74, with previous member David Cross playing the violin on it. Two other previous members of the band, Ian MacDonald and Mel Collins, played saxophone on 2 of the tracks. So despite the 3 of them, they brought in other musicians to round out the sound. And, as you heard, there's different music or instruments throughout, not just guitars and bass and drums. Red features more overdubs and a heavier sound from their past albums, credited to the influence of their rhythm section, Wetton and Bruford. Fripp once called them a flying brick wall because they played with such force and volume. So, and I feel like that comes through on this album. Much of the material on this album has origins in improvisation, and many songs were recorded or built together from various pieces, recorded previously or pieced together, sometimes adding sections and reprising themes and parts from earlier in the song. That seems to be a trend with prog rock that we've heard up to this point, and that's true here as well. The album has 5 tracks, 3 of them with lyrics. The lyrics to the 3 songs were not originally included on the album release, like on the album jacket, which was unlike all previous King Crimson albums, and I guess some people had an issue with that. They were not included until 2000 on the 30th anniversary release of this album. It spent 1 week on the British charts upon release, and it reached number 45 on the UK and 66 on Billboard in the US. Fripp became increasingly disenchanted with the group after this album's release. He talked of disbanding while on tour in the US, and then formally disbanded September 25th, 1974, 2 weeks before this album was released. Fripp later said King Crimson had, quote, ceased to exist and, quote, was completely over forever and ever. And I imagine that's what John will say when we're done with Coming the Stacks.
Which decade?
Yeah.
Between 75 and 81, the band was completely inactive. So throughout, not only do they have lineup changes, but they often have almost decades worth of time where they're inactive, or years where they're inactive. The band rejoined in 81, but they continued to have over 10 different lineup changes and 4 periods of inactivity. The next one, which would last from 84 to 94. So while they're still together and touring in some form or fashion, this is not a band that's stayed together or is even the same members. It's kind of just a band in name only, really, besides Fripp, who's pretty much the only through line through everything. So we're not covering King Crimson anymore, I don't think. There's nothing in the 80s, even though...
I think we cover King Crimson in the 80s.
Okay. We do. Discipline.
We do, yeah. Yep.
Okay. Well, then I will come back to them and forget all the lineup changes all over again and have to revamp that. So, John, what did you think of Red on this sophomore journey back into King Crimson?
So I remember when I was growing up or going back to the formative years of music, I would always hear from people that I respected about how heavy King Crimson was. And then I listened to King Crimson, but not this album. I listened to basically what we listened to earlier, right? And I remember thinking to myself, well, the standards just must have been different, prog rock, maybe it was just sort of, but I always remember being intrigued by that because I always hear how loud they were, how heavy they were. And the other people I heard that about in that era were people like, Black Sabbath and early Who, which you hear right off the bat. Yeah, they were right. This was a heavy, heavy album. Holy cow. It totally caught me off guard. This was almost like proto-metal at times. I was surprised by the wall of soundy type, metal, almost like kind of that sound that like thrash metal can get at times. Now they weren't playing thrash metal, but the sonic overlay of it. So that was really my first takeaway. Like, wow, this is a heavy album. And also the second was, wow, this is completely different than the album we covered from 1969 as well. Well, it makes sense because if nobody's there, I guess this is just the journey of where, Robert Fripp, right, was at that time. I listened to this album twice. I feel like I need to listen to this album more than twice because I felt there were both times I listened to it, I heard it differently. I would say that I liked this album, but it's dense in its own way, and it's a weird mix of prog rock meets heavy rock. And I don't know if we've gotten a mix of those two things yet. And it doesn't sound like the metal from the 90s and 00s that mixes prog and heavy, like, say, Mastodon or something, where Dream Theater, right? Like bands that kind of are doing the prog meets metal vibe. I guess to a lesser extent, Rush Trod's in that area at times, although I wouldn't really call Rush a metal band, but the same idea. I thought the songwriting was really interesting. Did you guys catch any of the songwriting, like what they were talking about on the album?
No, that's one thing I did not pay attention to.
Well, I don't want to take up too much space because I'm very curious as to both of your takes on this album, and I want to revisit with some other takes as well. But this is one where I think I want to get a baseline for what all of us think and then kind of go back and forth. So I'm going to punt to Matt real quick because this is one of the few times I have no idea what either of you guys are going to think about an album. Yeah.
This album is awesome.
Okay. So now I know what Matt thinks.
This album, holy crap. And John, you talk about it being heavy. It's particularly heavy with the bass. Yeah. Holy crap. This is as bass heavy of an album. We've talked a lot about bass. I don't know if I've heard bass as prominent and as in the forefront as we're hearing it throughout this entire album. And that is what it's just, and he's playing it. It's turned up, it's loud, and it's a deep bass sound. And it's great. And
can I real quickly jump in real quick? You know who that's similar to? Early Metallica with Cliff Burton.
Okay.
When I was saying, anyway, I just had to jump in there because that's what came to my music.
Yeah, I mean, the closest that I came to it was in terms of hearing the bass like that up front was Entwistle, with the Who, with some of the Who stuff we did. But this is heavier. I particularly liked the second and third tracks on the first side of the album, and I think both of them had, and actually the fifth track too, in Starless, they all had, there's free jazz in here. So you've got the saxophone guys are just going all over the place. They're doing the John Coltrane thing, they're doing the Pharoah Sanders thing, and the Eric Dolphy thing, where it's just kind of all over the place. And I really like that because underneath it all, it's couched in like the driving bass line or the melody or the rocking out part. So if as long as that stuff is not the focal point and like the only thing that's going on, I'm okay with it in there, and it's really, really cool. I mean, it's John, you said I've only listened to it twice. I need to listen to it more. Yeah, I think you do. I listened to this album several times, and the more I listened to it, the more I liked it. The guitar parts in both Fallen Angel and One More Red Nightmare have some really cool guitar parts that upon first listen you're like, okay, I kind of see what they're doing, and the more I listened to it anyway, the more I liked it, and the more that I got into it. I don't know what it is with King Crimson and needing to throw a song in there that's just kind of a bunch of experimental noises, but you're getting that. If that's your thing, you're getting that on Providence, which is by far my least favorite track on this. Mm-hmm. They redeem themselves a little bit in the last couple of minutes, but because they bring the bass back and they're kind of doing a little bit more of a traditional sound. So it's in that sense, it's better than, I forget the track that we covered in the Court of the Crimson King, but there's a really long, like just bleeps and bloops and just doesn't go anywhere in that song. At least this kind of builds to some type of resolve, but I wasn't really a huge fan of that. And Starless, I think this might win the award for my favorite song that I've never heard of in this decade. That
Wow.
song is awesome. It is so, I love what they do, and my biggest complaint with that, I think it's probably got my favorite minute. The last minute of that song, the resolve of that song is fantastic.
It's pretty chaotic at the end there.
It's at the very, but that's in the last in the last 3 minutes it kind of starts, because I remember I was timing it. The last 3 minutes, that's when it starts kicking in with like all the free jazz and the saxophones and the nuts and whatever. But the last minute it kind of comes back to a heavier version of what they were doing in the very beginning of the song with the bass. And for some idiotic reason, they only do that for a minute. They should be taking that part of the song and doing it for like 5 minutes, because that could have been the way that the bass is resolving there is just so. I was feeling that, man. That was getting me as into a song or a part of a song as much as I have in any song that I've heard in this entire podcast. That was an emotional reaction for me, and I just loved it. I'm so disappointed that they end it like that. It's over 12 minutes long, the song.
Yeah.
But I think that could have gone, that's where they should have gone long. They could have taken 5 minutes off of Providence and put it on the end of Starless and just really followed through that bass part. I encourage you guys to go back and look, because I thought it was fantastic. But Starless has some cool other parts to it. It starts off, I mean, there's like kind of like it starts off slow. It's like this, like, kind of, you think it's like a, I don't know, like almost like a ballad. I don't want to say ballad, but it's just like the slow part of the song, and just the way that it builds and the cool, the licks that they start doing. And the bass is just great in there. That song is phenomenal. I don't know why you didn't pick that to put in the montage, Josh. I would have just put both songs in the montage. It would have been different parts of Starless. That's how much I loved it. So, really liked it. This is a cool band. They've got a ton of other albums that I might have to go back and listen to. But yeah, these guys are badass.
All right, enthusiastic review from Matt. I like this album too. I'm not as high on it, I think, as you guys are. I really like kind of the underlying harder, aggressive, dark sound that they bring to it. That's the main thing I like. It's kind of menacing throughout. They're definitely like evoking like a mood through the songs, and through kind of the repetition of, I picked up on a lot of like repetition of the chords, and like they come back to things that they start at the beginning of the songs. It's not as like complicated. They're not throwing as much into the songs as like other prog that we've heard, so it was kind of like easier for me to kind of parse it out and see the themes. So I appreciated that as well. I just loved the bass and guitar like on this album as well. I thought that was really strong. They seemed confident in being able to, the song, there's only 5 tracks and the songs are long as a result, but they're able to maintain that darkness and that energy, but also they are not afraid to slow it down and take some breaks in songs and kind of almost regroup in a way, and that, or like come back to it. So I feel like that was, I appreciated that. There's some mellotron throughout these songs as well, especially in Fallen Angel and Starless. I didn't really pick that up. I mean, I read it and then I was trying to find it.
I picked it definitely up in Starless. Maybe not as much as the other one, but
I'm not, again, like John said, if I listen to this album again, I might appreciate more. I'm not sure how I feel about the vocal sound, not necessarily the vocal content, but like it's almost like their vocals don't match what the music brings to this or what I kind of want. I guess because it's like almost like a metal sound, I expect more of a metal like sound of vocals, and that's not really what they bring. So that kind of detracted or threw me off a little bit. And I'm still not sure how I feel about the horns coming in throughout these songs. You get a cornet in Fallen Angel, which is the second track, and then you get sax in One More Red Nightmare and Starless as well. And I think when I was listening to it, it kind of wins me over at some point, but it's kind of jarring too when it comes in. It contrasts that it's kind of hard to make horns sound dark, I guess, ultimately. And they do some weird sound effect distortions during the final horn part in One More Red Nightmare that were interesting. I mean, overall, this album sounds kind of like a horror movie soundtrack to me, or at least parts of one. Providence with that violin intro and screechy strings, and I think there might be some flutes or something in there as well. That's kind of all very like jarring and like making you uneasy like a horror movie would. There's sax and cello in Starless as well, so you got more strings and horns there. So yeah, I think they definitely did something different from Court of the Crimson King. I haven't listened to any of their other albums in between, and I appreciate their attempt to kind of do something darker but I wasn't like completely won over, so I'm like kind of thumbs 60%, 45-degree angle or something up on this one. They're not a band at this point that I would be like, oh man, I need to listen to the rest of their albums, or like I haven't grown an appreciation that way, in the way it sounds like Matt is leaning a little bit. They're not like a band that I want to discover more, but I appreciated this album. John, what did you think you were going to bring up the lyrical content, I think?
Well, it's interesting because I was just taking a peek at some stuff for some questions I had, and I see that Starless was used in the 2018 psychedelic psychological horror film Mandy, 2018, starring
Mandy.
One Nicolas Cage. Yes,
that's a great. That is an insanely metal horror movie too. So this is completely appropriate.
Well, that's why when you said that, I start laughing. Yeah. I said, "Well, you're on to something, Josh," because that's something that's mentioned specifically.
Insanely metal horror movie.
Yeah, it's one for the ages for sure. So interesting. Yeah.
Well, it's like, to me, the album lyrically, and I could be wrong on this, but it sounds like the band. The lyrical content is like the band unraveling, which was actually happening, right? And so the sounds like that chaos and stuff, I think, is reflected in some of the lyrics and also the sound of the album. It's like, in the best way possible. It's not an easy listen. It's a hard listen, but I don't mean that like in terms of hard, like as in easy hard listen, more in like challenging listen. And it's such an interesting album in context, because it's another one that doesn't quite fit with prog rock, but it's clearly a prog rock album. There isn't really metal at this point, or what it is like what Sabbath's doing, and this definitely isn't Sabbath. It's not that like down-tuned sound at all, because then you get these strings and stuff, so it belongs to like its own genre a little bit, and there really aren't bands doing this in this era, and it's only really until like the 80s and 90s, right, when bands start to do this quite a bit, like the sound of prog meets metal. And that's really what this is. It's that proto metal. And when Matt brought up like the bass being in the front, that is very much like, if you listen, and we will, trust me, in the 80s, if we get there, else if we don't King Crimson ourselves along the way.
We're not done forever and ever.
We'll listen to early Metallica, and like the bass is right up front and that stuff too. Or infamously totally removed once Cliff Burton dies in Justice for All. But that's I guess the best way I compare it to is that sound, but with sort of the lyrical content of prog rock. It's just a really interesting listen, and these are the type of albums I'm glad we stumble across, because I don't know if I would have detoured to King Crimson Red on my own, but it's definitely an album I'm glad we got to, because I'm interested to see where the sonic pieces of this album scatter in the 70s, 80s, and not. But I don't think we're going to see it in the 70s, right? I think it's going to be more like when we get to the 80s and 90s that we're going to see shards of this sound, coming back to life.
Yeah, it's like an interesting branch on the music tree, right? It goes in kind of its own direction, and then only later you get a little more branches off of it.
It's the King Crimson branch.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
But this to me, again, I think I listen to these albums, more than you guys do. It sounds like you listen to it just a couple times. I'm probably going more, 5-6 times.
Well, that's why you have the best musical takes in terms of the musicianship, Matt. That's what you bring to the table.
It's more of just this type of album demands that. Like when I first heard it, I was like, okay, all right, this is interesting. And it wasn't until tonight, honestly, when I listened to like that again, and or at least with Starless, that's when it really hit me tonight. And I was like, and I knew what was coming. I could pick up the parts. Because it's subtle, right? Because it starts off, the bass is there in the beginning. It's very subtle because, again, it's a slower part, more of the ballady type song. And it's the same bass part, but when he turns it up to 11 at the very end, it's like, holy crap. And it's done in a totally different way with a lot of other stuff behind it. I just love like discovering stuff like that and seeing like the intention behind, what they're doing and where they're taking you. And that, for me, can take several listens, but when... And this is the type of album, like I listen to the Clash a lot too, but my reactions didn't change all that much throughout the Clash album, because it was basically like right up front, I love it, it's great, it's a lot of fun. But this is like it's a journey. It takes a while, and boy, it paid off. Like tonight, I was like, holy, like Starless just blew my mind. I absolutely encourage people to listen to that song multiple times, because it's phenomenal. That is a wonderful piece of music right there.
I love when we get music boners, right? And obviously the Clash is a music boner for me, but this is for Matt. This is a music boner right here. So like poking through the airwaves
to his brain,
to the audience, music boner. So like that's what we're going to use as the term going forward for this. But yeah, it's awesome to hear you this enthusiastic, Matt. And I like this album quite a bit too. But I think the level it goes to for you that's always the cool ones. And I almost kind of sensed that it could be getting there, Matt, which is why I wanted to punt early, because I'm like, I wonder where Matt's either going to like this or the metal's going to overwhelm him. But if he likes it, he's going to love it. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I can't even tell you if they have another album that sounds like this or is dark. I think they may go in another direction again with the next lineup change or after their break and stuff. So,
well, they got to be one of the few bands we cover that'll have a 60s, 70s, and 80s entrant. Like we have there's a lot of artists that the 60s and 70s work well for them, and then they have like a renaissance in the 90s and 00s, right? Like Bowie and Dylan and stuff. But I don't know who else would be in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, we cover three albums in proper episodes, and one in each of those decades.
Yeah, interesting.
That's
we'll
unique.
Have to look back and see if there's any other 3 timers.
The only band I could think of is like the Stones. If like Tattoo You gets in there, maybe. But that's the only one I could think of that could possibly do that. So, yeah.
All right.